Hello everybody and welcome to Building for Peace with Hannah Jewell. Today we have as our guest Marc Stenham, and Marc works in agroforestry, which is an incredibly deep interest for me. I'd love to create an agroforest one day, and I'm so excited to have him on the show for this reason. He's been doing agroforestry for the last 10 years or so, has a background in organic farming. He works with school children on school projects, teaching them how to garden, and we're going to learn so much from him today. Welcome, Marc.
Thanks, Anne.
Yeah. Would you like to begin with a little bit of your story and how you started and what brought you to the place where you wanted to work with the land?
Yeah. I could say I feel like my story starts in, I don't know, a bit of a strange way of kind of waking up to nature, or waking up to the land. I grew up in Brighton, and just remember at the time in my late teens, going to parties out on the downs, and just finding myself in nature, perhaps maybe for the first time, of my own choice, going out there and just really turning onto it, and I think ever since then I've just more and more kind of embraced, wanted to understand more about how to work the land, how nature kind of revolves, and I think part of that in that part of my life, I think I was really struggling with the idea of empowerment, and how can I empower myself towards independent living, and I explored lots of avenues, whether that was by protesting, or living in other ways, perhaps like squatting, but exploring other ways of doing things. But food production, or growing food, just seemed like the way for me, and I really connected with that.
Yeah, so from this deep connection to nature you found in nature outside of the city, to a desire to live alternatively, and I think of a lot of us explored squatting and protesting and the free party scene. And then you, at a relatively young age, moved into gardening and working with the land for a sense of true independence. And you were describing when we were chatting earlier about how you started with an allotment, and then went into organic gardening. Tell us a little more about that.
So I think when I first started, I was helping up on a community garden that was in Brighton, and I saw the guys that run it the other day, actually, at a seed swap in Brighton. It was lovely to see them, and I remember 20 years ago, longer than that, going up and working with them, and I'm just thinking about what I love about it. I just love and I think in that time, it's not only about food production, but I think when you work the land, for me as well, it's also about community and fitness. And actually I quite like working hard and getting dirty and that kind of physical stuff. I'm not someone that have no care for pristine living, and I just found that working in that way, I could just really relax with it. It felt really right. So after working with the community garden, I took on an allotment for a while, began to learn how to grow, but I think there was definitely one of those things of, I think at that time in my life I was still kind of moving around quite a lot, quite nomadic, going abroad a bit and going off to festivals. And so I would start growing things but then not look after them because I wasn't there. And I think but the beginning of it was definitely the beginning of a process of learning or an interest of learning how to look after the land. And then from that I had a few years like where I went abroad and was working abroad, but then when I came back I started working at an organic farm which is over in like Plumpton, and that's really where I was already very interested and had some knowledge, but that's really where I began to learn a lot about growing food.
And that's when you began to experience the concept of roots, like rooting yourself to the land.
I mean, when you work the land, I think it's, and I'm even this year I'm becoming more and more aware of that rooting, like and just in terms of there's certain times of the year that are really important, especially like through the spring, where actually, you know, I don't think I can particularly go away on holiday during that time. You know, I need to be present and I need to be there. And I think about the idea of rooting, like Peter and Colette, who run this organic farm that I worked at, who still run it, who you know, they've been there for 30 years and rarely have a break, and they're just dedicated to working the land, and that is actually what, you know, that's what it truly takes to you've got to be rooted in to nurture the space. There's many aspects, but I can certainly think I would say it's a form of gardening that I can really connect to, a form of land management, where you're almost trying to do, experimenting with trying to put in the minimal amount of effort for the maximum amount of harvesting, and the way that is working is looking at the way plants and trees like naturally try and grow and prosper. So I often really enjoy when I'm walking in woodland or down by the river and just looking around to see how plants are working together. And then when I go into the garden that I'm working with, then I'm trying to mirror that as best as possible, so that again, you know, so that there can be a symbiotic relationship, so that things aren't competing with each other, but they're doing it in a favourable way.
Okay, so an agroforest is food forest, and the forest that we walk in is probably abundant with food if we knew what we were looking for. But we're sort of crafting that so it's more abundant with food, but still wild. What are some of the things you see in the forest that you replicate?
Everything. So, the agroforestry model is that everything that's in the garden is like a useful product. Generally, that means that it's edible, and otherwise beyond that, it means that there's going to be like the plants will have medicinal qualities, or it's going to be a plant that brings good wildlife into the garden, or it's going to create products that are useful for the garden. So I'm just a couple of weeks ago, there's some tall alder trees that are growing in the garden, and at the moment they're great because they have catkins on them that are edible. They're full of protein, and also I was discussing with a herbalist the other day about like the medicinal qualities, and then but yeah, there's a big row of them and they're very tightly packed. So I cut some down and logged them up, and I've been inoculating them with different mushroom strains, mushroom spores, to again add another food resource.
Okay, so in thinning the alders, we got another food resource of the mushrooms.
Mm-hmm.
And the alders are producing a catkin we can eat just now. And what else might they produce like later in the year?
I mean, later in the year the alders are also there for they're protecting the garden from like wind because they're relatively tall, and then they are also these kind of alders. They bring they fertilise the soil like into the garden, and they're in the highest part of the garden, so innately the nitrogen that they're producing is kind of coming down through the soil through the rest of the garden. So they don't, beyond the catkins in terms of their edibility, that's what they're bringing, but there's many other aspects that they're also bringing to you.
Nutrients, wind shelter.
And there's also
source.
a certain kind of like caterpillar that likes these alder trees that will eat some of the leaves and then bring a certain butterfly into the garden.
And what might that butterfly's role in the garden be?
I mean, just like the honeybee, the butterflies are going to be helping the pollination. I mean, bees are often the ones that are seen as like a significant insect for pollinating, but all insects, like flying insects that are moving around, are helping the pollination.
What are some other examples of plants that bring wildlife?
I can think of a few. So just around the garden, generally around the hedges, are some Eleagnus bushes, which are like they're called Russian olives, and there's two kinds in the garden that we've got like one which is quite a typical almost like typical garden plant that produces a fruit in the spring, and then there's a less common one which produces these lovely berries in the like silver berries in the autumn. And the spring fruiting one, the Eleagnus, is an evergreen, so there's lots of birds that live inside these bushes because they're very well protected. Like sparrows and blackbirds, and as well the spring fruit is for human consumption it's okay, but it's not great. There's a lot of seed and not much fruit, but for birds it's fantastic. And the bird life that they bring in is fantastic. And actually I've been feeling like there's been a family of blackbirds that I feel kind of lord over the garden, and they've become particularly friendly. So when I'm working around in the garden, they've just, especially the female blackbird, she'd just be there kind of a few meters away, kind of resting on the soil, like very. I think when a garden or land is worked in quite a peaceful way, like a nurturing way, then I feel like the wildlife becomes more trusting, and certainly with these blackbirds, and the benefits they bring of then they're also going around the garden eating, like slugs and snails and and aphids.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of helping to address a better balance anyway in the garden.
Yeah, so that's another level of reciprocity there with the animal spirits.
Mm-hmm.
And their trust in the garden as a place of safety and a place to flourish. Do you feel like you actually have a relationship with the animals in the garden?
I certainly do with this Blackbird family. Yeah, I feel, I don't know whether close is the right word, but there's a connection. Yeah, I mean, around in the garden as well. I'm really against like burning any material like for burning's sake. So any cuttings, and if they're too woody to compost, then I just create these kind of dead wood kind of fencing areas or like windshields for animals to kind of get into, where they're protected, especially things like I guess it's like there's quite a lot of mice around in the garden. So there's I'm really kind of more and more creating habitats for wildlife in the space.
What about wildlife that's typically seen as a pest, like rabbits, deer, beavers? They can eat a garden in half a night, the whole thing.
I can say thankfully, I think where the garden's located, there's not many deer around in that area. If any, I'm not sure I've seen any in that part of the Downs. And there's a rabbit fence around the garden to keep them out. Certainly the mice, and I think there's a rat that's living under one of the potting shed that's been nibbling some of the salad leaves that are in the greenhouse. And the mice have enjoyed some of the the annual root vegetables that are around in the garden. They really enjoyed some of the beetroots this year. I can see their little tooth marks in there. But that's
So you don't mind sharing a little bit with the animals?
No.
Yeah.
I mean, to me anyway, I'm not. I don't mind whether, say, like a beetroot looks pristine. I don't, if it's got a few gnaw marks in it, I'll just cut that piece out and I'll eat the rest. That feels. I know there's something I always think about when I'm eating, and I have if I've got a dog, so the dog's with me, or if I have my children or guests, like a Buddhist quote of it's really important to always share a good portion of your food, and certainly that's that's certainly with the forest gardening, the food forest, it's making sure that wildlife, life that's in the garden that's not human life is also has some food there. Because it creates a beautiful, a harmonious space. One of the biggest pests as a gardener is slugs and snails. And doesn't matter whether that's an annual crop or a perennial, and finding some way of balancing that. The last few years, when I first started in the garden, I was really focused around, I've got to get the slug and snail population reduced. So we used to, with the volunteers on site, I used to come up with some bottles of wine, and at night time we'd get our head torches on and go into the garden and pick all the spinach plants and salsa would be covered in literally covered in them. It was horrible. especially in the spring, and we'd pick them all off. And actually now, like the last few years, I've stopped doing that, and I think like the life of the garden is balanced out. Well, yeah, like the birds, and there's also a pond, like the pond life is really helping to. And perhaps there's some hedgehogs in the garden. I imagine there probably are, with these kind of woody piles that I've built up that have all had an influence. So now, so that the main pest of the slugs is greatly reduced. Yeah. And I just think in terms of that, like the pests, also the diversity of plants, and people often ask me about like companion planting, and I often feel that it's almost a different model to companion planting, because there is such diversity really mixed up through the whole space. There's constant companions for every plant. There's not this like, I mean, even on an allotment where you can have these like specific spaces of like, this is the food space, and so you've got to create their companions or their positive partnerships. But in the forest garden, it already exists.
Yeah. So a forest garden doesn't have like rows set out. It's more things are moving in and around all of the different trees and shrubs, and most of the things are edible. What does it look like, and what does it feel like to walk through that kind of space?
Yeah. So it feels, I mean, it just like any garden, it feels really different through different seasons. What really strikes me is I know that by the 1st of May, it will be wildly green, and it almost, at the moment in its winter, like, I guess like skeletal shapes, you begin to see like the separate plants a little bit, but by the 1st of May, it's just these rolls of green, from the ground up onto like small shrubs and bigger ones, and then up into the trees, and then through the vines, where there's not necessarily like a strong differentiation. Yeah.
Do you have to know what you're looking for in order to find food in the garden?
Again, I think it depends on the time of year. Like, in the winter, you need to know what you're looking for. But yeah, in the midsummer, when all the fruits are coming, then they really display, what they have to offer. I probably have, I mean, and certainly with the leaves, I probably experimented with trying most of the leaves. I actually feel that most plants are probably edible.
So give us some examples of leaves that you can eat from a food forest that you might not eat otherwise.
So in a food forest, the leaves from the lime tree, they're quite well known, that like the young leaves are really good. Also, I quite like making earlier in the season of like just herb salads. So like lemon balm leaves, sage leaves, what else is there? Even I guess like fennel leaf, and then the leaf from it's like a globe artichoke, but a cardoon, like using the leaves from that. And then there's a whole, even like black currant leaves are quite tasty.
those up with like olive oil, like a
Yeah.
regular salad?
Yeah, just mix them up like a regular salad, yeah.
Do they take a lot of chewing, and do they feel
No,
digestible in your stomach?
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you know, often in the spring, those early leaves are actually they're quite delicate. They're quite soft. Like it's only when when things age and they touch up against the kind of environment and climate that they toughen up. But yeah, like in the springtime, again, yeah, most leaves are actually quite good. Yeah.
Yeah. Right, and then when the leaves are getting tougher, then we have the fruits to eat.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about perennial versus annual plants
Yeah.
and how this is so important in a food garden.
Yeah. I mean, again, like perennial plants. I mean, that's, you know, generally in I'm like looking out the window here, like that's what you see. Like perennial plants are plants that they're there all the time. They're hardy, like, which means that they're strong. And strong to me means, you know, they can survive really cold winters. They survive the wind. They don't really need much help from me. They're just going to grow. And yeah, and they're so in the forest garden, like with the perennial plants that are there, that they are like strong plants that will produce their food or their medicine, whether I'm there or not. They're just going to do that. And they're also going to, like, their strength is also, if they're next to another plant, they're going to hold their space. Like they're going to control it. Again, without me, I might need to help a little bit, but I don't want to help too much. I think that's the nature of where I'm trying to enable things to kind of naturalize, and maybe not, like, I don't quite like the word wild, but like yeah, be their true spirit. Yeah, without me having to intervene. And then yeah, and perennial foods, like simply like so there's an annual or a perennial kind of leek that's in the garden called a Babington's leek that at the moment are looking fantastic. And I mean, I don't have to do anything, you know. I'll just come and harvest them, and in the summer they have their bulbs in the ground, and they send up some new ones, which I can just take and scatter around, and more will come up. It's very relaxed, and again, they're strong plants. I think some plants, and I notice it in strawberries, another perennial, that they must release certain chemicals that stop other plants kind of coming into that root base, like, and these Babington leeks must be releasing a certain chemical that is kind of impinging other plants invading their space. And then on the flip side to the perennials are annuals, and so yeah, I've recently I've sown my first seeds of the spring, and I'm aware that as soon as I do that with annual plants, like the rest of it's the beginning of a process of, like, once I've done that, and thankfully we're still in February and the weather's still a bit cool, so it's not racing away. But once we get to March and it warms up, I'm going to continually be sowing seeds and nurturing these seedlings, and it's very time consuming. And then beyond that, you know, what can and then I'm going to have to take these plants, plant them out, look after them again, because the annual plants are the ones that the pests, like garden pests, will be really interested in, because they're the more, like, maybe the softer leaves, especially when they're young, softer leaves, perhaps like because they're younger as well, like they've got more like nutrition held within them, more vitality. And so then their annual plants are incredibly time consuming. And the perennial plants are absolutely don't need any time at all. In fact, the thing with perennial plants is probably when some of them, say like a blackcurrant, is that when it does come to harvesting them, or the silverberries, is that it takes time to pick them. But but that's quite a joyous thing to do, just to harvest. But yeah, the annuals, there's continual monitoring and watering and caring for them. And of course, annual plants have, and annual flowers are beautiful, and annual vegetables are highly nutritious and voluminous, and certainly have a place. But I find in the garden of finding a balance between the perennial and the annual. That there's in my forest garden there are spaces for annuals, but every year I'm aware of actually I need to be doing less of the spring work and the summer work for the annuals, and allow more space for the perennials where I can be a more relaxed gardener. So more and more space in the forest garden, or like I'd say, more of the annual spaces get taken away every year. In fact, this year I'm probably down to, I'm not sure I can reduce it any more than I have.
Is it about like 30% annuals, 50% annuals? Where are you at with it?
I think when I first started and the garden was quite young, like in terms of the perennials, there's probably around about, probably like 60% of it was annuals, because there was still lots of space. And I'm like with perennial plants, like especially with forest gardening plants, they're incredible, because instead of sowing seeds for them, I mean, some you sow seeds. Generally you take cuttings, you divide roots, and over 10 years, I've like the perennials have spread, and I've spread them, and now I'm probably from maybe 60% of annual space now maybe down to around, what would it be, maybe 20%. Maybe less than that, 15%. And maybe next year I'll be feeling like, okay, going to reduce it down again.
So you've got so much growing on its own, and your presence in the garden, like you said, is more relaxed. But does this garden actually feed you? Do you produce a significant amount out of it?
In the garden there's the couple, Roger and Susie, it's on their estate, on their land, so it produces food for me and my family, and produces food for them. And there is also, we're part of the woofing scheme, so willing workers on organic land, and so it produces food for the woofers there, and there's volunteers that come up and work with me too, that also take food away. And when there's real times of bountiful and harvest, if there's way too much, then that food will I'll try and feed it into either towards a food bank or to a homeless charity. Try and find a resource for it. And all through the year there's the garden is giving foods, and and yeah, at the time now, which there's like the hungry gap that's often talked about, and yeah, and I'm finding this year that like I'm really finding that I'm perhaps not experiencing that, with the you know, I could say it's like it is hand in hand between the annual foods. You know, I still have quite a few pumpkins and squashes sitting around in my kitchen, and I just harvested last week, all, like, not all of them, but the last of the root vegetables, like annual root vegetables that were there. I've been trying to be very well behaved of eating a Swede every week, which is not, for me, not easily done, but you know, that's a lot of Swedes.
You don't like Swedes?
I like them, but like in the kitchen, it takes quite a long time to cook a Swede. You got to boil it for a long time. Yeah, and what I'm really noticing with the Hungry Gap is not only that this year there's that like ample of, seem to have quite a good amount of annuals. There's also there's like perennial foods that they're like supporting. So like things like Jerusalem artichokes, the cardoons are like giving their leaves. There's already the sorrel leaves have started growing. And then there's these alliums, like these perennial leeks, and there's some perennial onions that are there. So there's and also I'm just thinking the tuna tree has just started like giving some of its leaves as well, which are almost like spinach.
Food to eat during what is traditionally called the Hungry Gap. In traditional farming, the Hungry Gap is where we haven't planted the spring things yet, the winter vegetables have run out, there's nothing like popping out in nature. We could hunt if we wanted to live on meat alone, but we're kind of hungry. That's what it means. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But there's actually a whole bunch of perennial. Are they almost wild? Like, would you consider these wild foods in a way?
Yeah, they are wild foods. Yeah. And I think wild foods. Yeah, they have. They've got a different energy, different quality. I just find it quite strange when you walk in a supermarket and like all the foods are, all the vegetables, all the foods, I mean, not all of them, but in that beginning area of the fresh foods, they're generally like all annual vegetables, which we see as like that's the right, that's the food that humans eat.
Right.
And I think that when you like fresh wild food, I even think of like ate the other day like wild garlic, like the first leaves, like wow, like these foods they're quite tangy and incredibly like nutrient rich. Yeah. And
it's like there's the whole thing about reciprocity with land and with animals, but then about with like other humans too. I'm just so aware how in this country we're reliant on all these annual vegetables being grown in Spain coming to feed all of us. And what if that system breaks down at some point? It's just not natural. So what would we have eaten? We were talking earlier about like before the potato came to Europe and the UK, right? What did we actually eat? Tell us a little bit more about this kind of, it's not ancient, but an older way of eating.
Yeah. So I think what, and not just with potatoes, I mean, we could think about that whole family which like seems to reign in gardening these days, of like potatoes, tomatoes, chilies, peppers, aubergines. Like these are almost like gold in the gardening world. And I mean, what would it have looked like before? I think there would have been leaves. I really think that the beet family, so chard and leaf beet like spinach, as well as beetroot, would have been a huge part of like Northern European food, as well as things like Swedes and turnips. Yeah, which I'm receiving more and more, but they certainly do challenge me.
I can eat a Swede, but I do not like turnips, and I do not like parsnips.
A turnip, I could almost eat straight from the ground. They're delicious. Like peel the skin off and just get into it. Amazing.
I have to make myself eat turnips.
Yeah.
But I suppose I can, rather than be hungry. It's almost a matter of allowing our palate to adjust.
Yeah. I mean, I think a really important thing as well about I was talking to someone on the weekend about it who was from Norway, and it was really interesting talking to him about the hungry gap, where like, of course, like in places further north in Europe, like, the hungry gap is extreme. And what's really important is, you can't rely on fresh foods anymore. And again, what's really important, an ancient way, is really knowing what to do. It's not just about growing food, but also knowing what to do with it to preserve it. So he was talking a lot about like salting and smoking fish, and having memories of his grandparents doing that. That was, he was saying that he remembers when they were children, like they were living on a farm and they didn't have any shoes. Like they were lucky if they had new clothes, and generally through the winters they just ate salted fish. Like that's what there was for them. And with the food forest, really important part of food production is not just about growing it, but also knowing how can I store it. And again, that helps to, when the hungry gap arrives, then it's not an issue.
Right, because you've got things, and this is not just like canning and creating all sorts of like chutneys and things like this. It's also about knowing how to store things in space, isn't it? Like with your squashes and your cabbages, do you need a cold, dark space to keep them?
That would be helpful.
Help, yeah.
I mean, I'm probably quite relaxed with the squashes. I just have them around the house. But yeah, certainly other things. They need to be stored somewhere like cool and dry. Some things like to be like buried as well, either in sand or in hay or in soil. If you're going to still rely on the fresh, or over the years what I do with a good quantity of the juice that gets made from the apples is turning it into cider, and then utilising that vinegar, like the cider vinegar, I'm not turning cider into cider vinegar, and then utilising that vinegar for preserving things within.
Super.
Bottling them up within the vinegar, and that
and fermenting, and there's loads of ways you can store seeds, isn't there? Like seeds not just to grow, but seeds for consumption, because they're not going to be coming out in the winter, but they're a great source of nutrition in the winter.
Absolutely. There's a just thinking like picked a lot of rose hips in the autumn, and there's still a huge sack of rose hips, which are incredibly nutritious food.
How do you eat rose hips? It's not a food we typically eat.
I mean, just so the rose hips have got you can just stew them. The only thing with rose hips is that inside them they've got the seeds, which are quite they're irritants, or I think they were maybe used as like pranks, like for kids, like in teenagers, like they can make you feel like really itchy. But yeah, I know people that when they cook with them, they cook all of it, the seeds as well. I prefer to try and remove the seeds.
So you like cook it down and strain the seeds out?
Yeah, or take this, once they're dried, they're quite easy to work with. You just cut them in half and scrape out the seeds. And because they're all dried, you know, to do that first and then rehydrate the flesh, and then you can cook with it however you want to. Yeah, and it's very sweet.
Yeah, fantastic. There's such a world opening that's like a bridge between foraging and standard garden, and I love this idea where you can have the wild food in the garden that you live in. How big is the garden at Rodmell? Tell us a little more about this specific garden and the projects you have going on with it.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's probably it's probably about an acre, maybe a bit smaller. Yeah, so it's not huge.
Yeah.
But yeah, I had somebody else came to visit me, a friend who has a forest garden there, and he was remarking that just how I really love to like pack things in, and then plant things quite close together and allow things just to kind of muscle out with each other. Work out how they, or even allow, because I'm just taking plants from cuttings or from splitting roots. I'm not being that precious about them. So I just let them be in the space, and then whichever plant wins out can have the space. So it's a very full garden, and in the summer, just everywhere you look, it's I would say literally dripping with fruits and vegetables and edibles.
Yeah.
And in terms of the, I think when it comes to my realization, like with working any land project, is that it's so important to have like community. I don't really get much from working on my own. I get probably a lot done when I'm working on my own in the garden, but I prefer to be working with other people. And people do, and there's volunteers that come and work with me, there's woofers that come and stay for a few months and come and learn from me. And as much as there's that like knowledge sharing going on, gardens are incredibly, I've always experienced this. I remember it a lot when I worked on the farm, and I'm experiencing it now when I'm in the forest garden, where gardens are incredibly healing spaces, where people share themselves very openly. And when you work with someone through a day, you talk the world, and you really explore things, and this is again like and for me, I could say my whole, as a gardener, I feel like I'm getting, or like as a food grower, I'm getting the vitality from the food. Working the land helps to keep me fit, and working with a community on the land helps to keep me my mental health expressed and more stable. So it's kind of fulfilling many of my needs.
The physical, the emotional, and the soulful are all getting met through this garden. And how many of us are missing one or two aspects of those fulfillments in our life? And if we can get those through gardening, how amazing is that? And not just a garden that you go to, but that you live in. Tell us a little bit about the weaving of your life, Marc, because I know you're also an acupuncturist and you're not at the garden every day, and you see your community, and there's a whole weaving about healthy lifestyle as you're speaking of.
Yeah, I think I've begun to realize more and more how important it is for that we need to. For me, I mean, I can only speak for me. But for me, it really works to try and be finding some kind of, in my work life and in fact my whole life, some kind of balance. And I guess from the bringing in, like, as an acupuncturist or Chinese medicine, balance, I'd be thinking about yin and yang, and what that actually means. And what I really like as an acupuncturist, I mean, what I really like about my work life is that, I mean, I love working with people and I love working as a therapist, but I'm not sure I'd want to do it all week. Personally, I just find myself getting bored, and so getting out, when I'm in the garden, I love the physicality, I love the loosened conversation that happens, and of course, like the working outside and being in nature, which is really important to me. But yeah, as a therapist, I love the depth of sharing, like the intimacy of healing, of healthcare. And what's really interesting is that in Chinese medicine, Chinese philosophy, Oriental philosophy, Chinese philosophy, all of the descriptions, all of those conversations take place around observing nature and understanding like seasonal changes and or even watching how, like, certain plants grow. Like, that's often how things are described in some of the classical, like, texts of understanding how things are working within the body in Chinese medicine, or even in Chinese medicine, there's not even an interest in what's going on inside the body. It's always seen that the body is actually a reflection of what's going on in the world, like how the universe, how our world, the earth, how things actually, how those ecosystems work is the same inside us. So as a, I find that I learn a lot from working in the garden, about how I should be practicing as an acupuncturist. Yeah, and I could also say vice versa. Sometimes when I'm working with someone and I see a particular condition and the way that their body's reacting, it can really remind me of something in the garden, like a certain plant, or and it's or a certain, perhaps, like, area that's like this in the garden that I could say is wild or dysfunctional or beyond my control, but I can also kind of relate back into what's going on for them. So yeah, I find it incredibly like either way, I find it there's this real sharing that goes on between the two, like these knowledges. That I really appreciate.
That was such a beautiful description of the philosophy of, like, the ecosystem inside of us is the same as the ecosystem of the universe and the ecosystems of the earth, and that's just a whole nother layer to reciprocity and the holographic nature of life, and just really makes me think about how much wildness we actually need in our life. That's maybe not chaotic wildness, but where things are allowed to grow and to flourish in their own way.
Yeah. For me at the moment, I really I feel like I'm personally exploring that idea of like flow, and beyond that idea of, you know, of how do we, like you could say like a tree has its nature and it just lives it. How do we get as comfortable as that, like as that tree, where we can be, you know, like truly liberated, truly flowing in that liberation, to, you know, to really exude our beauties and not feel that kind of cultural society kind of oppressing us, yeah, or holding us back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Just shining rather than trying to fit in. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a good start.
Uh-huh. Well, is there anything else you would like to share with us today that I might not have asked about, that you just feel so important to food forestry, agroforestry, or where we are at in our culture with our transitions toward more sustainable living?
Yeah, okay. What can I say? I think just coming back to that idea of like self-empowerment, I think, yeah, and with that, I mean, you know, self-empowerment sounds quite like isolated. Perhaps we need to think about like community empowerment, you know, like I couldn't be an acupuncturist without people, to like other people, like patients coming to work with me, and there's no point me working the land just for me. That feels very isolated. So so I think there's that way. I think it'd be great to encourage more like empowerment, like community empowerment, and I'm aware of more and more that there's things going through, like where it's becoming easier to set up like community gardens, and getting people on the land, and communities getting back on the land. And within that, it's not just talked about as, you know, as providing food, but also the sheer mental health and wonders of not only that quiet space of doing something practical and physical, but also of the relaxed sharing, the accompaniment that happens. So I think that's a really important thing.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that through. That's where we began with your journey, starting through self-empowerment.
Yeah. But I think, you know, what's interesting for me, perhaps reflecting now, is like, perhaps that journey was that I could start off as like self-empowerment, and you know, and actually probably acted quite selfishly, and and probably, you know, maybe in that like early 20s, like not really looking for community or looking to settle down, but now like really again coming like looking for the roots of life, and realizing that necessity for engagement with others, for fulfillment.
Yeah. So if others would like to join you as volunteers, or get on the woofing scheme, or just meet you and come for acupuncture and learn from you, how do they find you?
How do they find me?
Yeah,
I can be a little bit elusive, but I can be found.
Hiding in the bushes.
Again, I guess with that idea of like liberation and flow. On Wednesdays are always like open volunteer days in the forest garden, in the food forest, and that can be found like online, Rodmell Food Forest, And then, as an acupuncturist, you can just put my name in. I work down in Sussex, and And my name's Marc Stenham, so there we are.
There we are. Well, it's been so wonderful to have you here today, Marc.
Yeah, welcome.
It's been a really delightful conversation, and I definitely feel the spring roots coming alive as we sit here today with the daffodils.
Beautiful,
yeah. And the beauty of the earth. Thank you for sharing this time.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. Yeah.
So, Marc Stenham with the Rodmell Food Forest. His links will be in the descriptions. If you would like to contact me about getting on the podcast or anything, please go to hanajewelofpeace.com. Thank you so much for joining us today.